How much of what we hear as timeless musical greatness were shaped by systems deciding what could be created, preserved, performed, and remembered? Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
It is a question that completely upends how most of us actually experience art. Because we walk into a concert hall or, put on headphones, and we just assume we're experiencing this pure meritocracy of sound.
Right, because, if you are anything like me, when you sit down to listen to a classical masterpiece, say a Beethoven symphony or like a Mozart opera, you fall for this very natural, very beautiful illusion.
Oh, for sure.
You imagine this isolated divine genius. You picture them sitting alone in a room, just plucking these self-contained perfect sounds out of thin air, writing them down by candlelight, and handing them directly to us across the centuries.
Yeah, we tend to view surviving music as if the cream just simply rose to the top, entirely unassisted by the outside world. But the reality is that the music that actually reaches your ears today had to survive a massive invisible gauntlet.
I really want to focus on that word gauntlet, because music doesn't just survive on its own merit. It only survives if it manages to successfully navigate these incredibly complex grinding systems.
Exactly.
We're talking about the invention of notation, systems of religious preservation, the rigid rules of aristocratic patronage, ruthless commercial market forces,
Technological limitations, too.
right? And ultimately, the curated cultural memory of the state. If a genius composer fails to navigate even one of those systems, their work just vanishes.
And to unpack the mechanics of that gauntlet, the source material we're using as our lens today is A Student's Guide to Music History by R.J. Stove.
And let's be super clear on our mission for this deep dive.
Huh?
We aren't here to just recite a timeline of dead composers. You can find a chronological timeline anywhere on the internet.
Right, that's not what we do here.
What we are doing is using Stowe's work to investigate how historical context and structural systems actually dictate what you, the listener, are physically able to hear today.
And Stove has a core thesis that we need to present fairly. He borrows a phrase from the British composer and critic Constant Lambert, arguing that we need to banish the idea of music as mere oral tickling.
Oral tickling, I love that phrase.
It's great, right? He's saying that when you add historical awareness to your listening, you give the music a three-dimensional quality.
Yeah.
You start connecting the stylistic shifts in the notes themselves to the humanity and the unyielding systems that the composers were just, forced to operate within.
Before we jump into the deep end, though, there is some crucial context we need to set for you, the listener, because we always want to impartially acknowledge the bounds of the texts we examine.
Absolutely.
Stove notes right in his preface that his scope is admittedly, and I think he says defiantly, Eurocentric. He points out that this is largely due to space constraints. He's writing a concise guide to a very specific lineage of Western classical music.
It is also vital that we distinguish between the established historical facts he brings to the table, the dates, the survival of manuscripts, the mechanics of the patronage systems, and his personal editorial synthesis.
Right.
Because Stove offers some very subjective, pointed critiques of modern state-funded arts and atonal music,
Yeah.
which we will analyze structurally later on. But we are here to report his findings and examine the underlying systems, not to endorse his personal aesthetic or, political judgments.
Exactly. We are looking at the machinery.
Yeah.
And to understand how systems shape music, we have to start at the absolute beginning, the primary system. We have to look at the technology of memory.
Because without a system to record it, music is quite literally just vibrating air. It vanishes the second the performer stops playing.
That is such a terrifying thought when you scale it up to the entirety of human history, the unwritten void. Like, Stove points out that ancient Greek music is essentially entirely lost to us.
Yeah, completely gone.
We have a few fragmentary snippets carved into stone that modern scholars can only sort of guess at deciphering. We know music was central to their culture, to their theater, but we just cannot hear it.
And the same applies to the Roman Empire. We all know the famous phrase about Nero fiddling while Rome burned, right?
The classic image.
Well, as Stove points out, first of all, it wasn't a fiddle, it was a lyre. But more importantly, we have absolutely no idea what Nero actually played on it.
Or what King David played on his harp in biblical times.
Exactly. The air vibrated and then it was gone forever.
So without technology, the music dies.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the earliest composer whose output actually survives in bulk. We have to jump all the way to the 12th century, to a German nun, poet, and mystic named Hildegard of Bingen.
Yeah, Hildegard. She called herself a feather on the breath of God. and around 80 of her pieces survive today.
Okay, so if I were to listen to her music today, what would it actually sound like?
Well, if you were to hear her original written output, Stove notes, you might assume it was standard plainchant, which is to say monophonic music.
And monophonic just means,
It just means a single, unaccompanied melodic line, everyone singing the exact same notes at the exact same time, with no harmonizing instruments. Now, modern editors often add instruments when they record her work today to make it more palatable to modern ears, but her raw, surviving data is a single vocal line.
but the question for our systems level analysis isn't just what she sounded like. It's why does Hildegard survive when thousands of other medieval musicians didn't?
Right, that's the key.
It's not just because she was a genius, though obviously she clearly was. It's because she was operating within the protective recording apparatus of the medieval Catholic Church. I was thinking about this, and the best analogy for the medieval church in this context is that it was essentially the ultimate server farm, like the only cloud backup of the era.
That is a highly accurate parallel, actually, because monasteries and convents were the absolute centers of literacy, of manuscript copying, and of preservation. They possessed the physical resources, parchment, ink, dedicated scribes.
Stuff that was incredibly expensive.
Incredibly. But more importantly, they had the institutional mandate to record information for posterity.
So if your music wasn't uploaded to their specific server farm, it got permanently deleted by time. The system decided what lived. And the church's system was so incredibly robust that it even accidentally preserved its own antithesis.
Oh, this is a great example.
You know the Carmita Burana?
The famous 1930s choral work by Karl Orff.
Right. Everyone knows that massive dramatic opening chorus, O Fortuna, from like every movie trailer ever.
Yeah.
Well, Orff ransacked these bawdy, profane, highly irreverent 13th century songs for his lyrics. They're songs about drinking, gambling, and physical lust.
Not exactly holy material.
Not at all. But those original, intensely secular lyrics only survived to the 20th century because the manuscript happened to be stored in a Bavarian monastery. The church's preservation system was so monolithic it saved the very secular culture it actively opposed, simply by acting as the era's only reliable hard drive.
And you have to realize that institutional power didn't merely preserve things passively. It actively dictated and standardized what music should be. Consider the towering myth of Gregorian chant.
Okay, let's dismantle this because this blew my mind. The pious tradition I was always taught is that Pope Gregory the Great, back in the 6th century, had this beautiful music dictated directly to him by the Holy Spirit, in the form of a dove whispering in his ear.
It is a striking visual image and one that was heavily promoted in medieval art. But as Stove points out, modern scholars ascribe the codification and spread of what we call Gregorian chant not to a 6th century pope, but to the era of Charlemagne, who was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800.
Wait, really? Charlemagne?
Yes, Charlemagne actively championed a specific, papally approved style of chant from Rome, brought it to his territories in France, and forcefully pushed it across Europe.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the structural mechanics here. This wasn't a divine dove. This was a political system using music as a tool of statecraft. Charlemagne is trying to unify a massive, fragmented empire. So he uses a standardized form of worship music to force everyone onto the same page.
Precisely. It is centralization through sound. And in doing so, this top-down system deliberately overwrote and erased the vibrant, localized variations of chant that had existed for centuries across Europe.
Like Mozarabic chant in Spain or Gallican chant in France. They just got wiped out by the standardized update.
Yes, essentially deleted. When political power dictates what is holy and what is allowed to be transmitted, you are seeing a system engineer cultural memory. The surviving music is the music the emperor endorsed.
That's wild to think about.
But to truly engineer that memory, to ensure a monk in Paris sang the exact same notes as a monk in Rome, the system needed a technological leap.
We are talking about the invention of notation.
Right. Around the year 1030, a Benedictine monk named Guido d'Arezzo popularized the use of staves to indicate musical pitches.
Wait, I need to understand the before picture here. If they didn't have staves, those horizontal lines we see on sheet music today, how on earth did a choir memorize like an hour of chanting?
Before the stave, European music relied on something called neumes. These were essentially little squiggles or dots written above the words of the text.
What did the squiggles actually tell the singer?
Very little, objectively. They only indicated the general direction of the melody, whether the next note went up, went down, or stayed the same. They did not tell you how far up or down to go.
So if I'm looking at a Numi, I already know the song in my head to be able to sing it.
Exactly. It was fundamentally an oral tradition, and the neumes were just a memory aid. If you had never heard the song before, a manuscript of Newman's was completely useless to you.
Wow.
So Guido d'Orenzo's introduction of the stave changed the paradigm. By drawing horizontal lines and assigning specific pitches to those lines and the spaces between them, you could, for the first time, lock in an exact pitch. And that evolved over the next few centuries into the five-line stave we recognize today.
It's like moving from a map drawn on a napkin that just says go north to a precise GPS coordinate.
And once you can map pitch accurately, you unlock a completely new, staggering capability, which is complex polyphony.
Polyphony meaning harmonizing. Multiple different melodic lines happening at the exact same time. They called this organum. And this brings us to a specific physical place, the Notre Dame School in Paris in the late 12th century, with figures like Léonin and Pérotin.
We know about these composers largely because of a mysterious English student known to history only as Anonymous IV, who took extensive notes on how they were the greatest creators of organum. But structurally, looking through Stove's lens, we have to ask a broader question. Why Paris?
Right.
Why did this explosion of complex written harmony happen at the Cathedral of Notre Dame rather than somewhere else?
I was actually wondering about that, because at the exact same time in history, you have the secular troubadours in Provence or the Minnesänger in the German territories. They're out there writing courtly love songs, traveling around. But their music is mostly monophonic, single-line melodies, and it's intensely regional. Why didn't they invent complex harmony?
The secular music remained localized and structurally simpler because it lacked institutional concentration. Think about what Notre Dame in Paris represented in the 12th century. It was a massive architectural project, a wealthy hub of theology, and the center of a nascent university environment.
A huge concentration resource.
Exactly. When you have an institution that large, stable, and well-funded, it acts as an incubator. It allows for the compounding of complex ideas.
You have dozens of highly trained musicians interacting every single day in the same building, experimenting, writing things down with this new stave technology, and revising each other's work over decades.
That is how you get complex polyphony. The troubadours, moving from isolated court to isolated court, simply didn't have the institutional infrastructure to build, test, and preserve multi-layered harmonic systems in the same way. The system dictates the ceiling of the complexity.
So the church built the primary system, they created the technology of preservation and the centralized hubs for innovation. But as we move forward in time, the power to dictate what gets created begins to splinter. The system shifts. We move out of the cathedral and into the aristocratic court, and eventually into the commercial market.
This is a crucial pivot. By the time we reach the Renaissance, composers are largely operating under the rules of the aristocratic patronage system. Kings, dukes, and princes are funding the music to project their own wealth and power. And what's fascinating to observe is how raw talent began to create leverage within that system.
Yeah, these composers weren't just stuck in one parish for their entire lives anymore. Stove gives the example of the Netherlander Roland de Lassus in the 16th century. Lassus gets one of the most prestigious jobs in all of Europe, working in Rome at the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Well, he's only in his early 20s.
Which is incredible on its own.
Right. But then within a year, he just quits. He leaves to go visit his sick parents. And it doesn't ruin his career. He eventually moves to Munich, reaches comparable heights, and even gets knighted by the Pope. The system allowed for incredible mobility if you had the goods.
The aristocratic system could offer mobility, but it could also offer an incredibly dark, protective bubble. It created an environment of immunity that allowed for startling artistic freedom, sometimes masking horrific personal behavior. The most extreme example Stove provides is Carlo Gesualdo.
Oh, man. Gesualdo. Let me set the stage for this, because it sounds like a true crime podcast. Gesualdo is an Italian prince, the Prince of Venosa, in the late 1500s. He catches his wife in bed with her lover, the Duke of Andria. And Gesualdo literally murders both of them.
Yes, brutally.
He doesn't just hire an assassin, he stabs them to death himself, absolutely butchers them.
And because he is a prince, a high-ranking member of the nobility, he is completely untouchable by the official justice system of the era. There is no trial, there is no execution, but while the state ignores his crime, he is psychologically tormented.
Kind of loses his mind, right?
He retreats to his castle. He supposedly forces his servants to ritualistically flog him as penance for his sins.
And all of that unpunished anguish, all of that intense psychological horror just pours directly into his music. He writes these vocal pieces, madrigals, that are so intensely dissonant, so hyper-emotional, with harmonic progressions that are bafflingly ahead of their time. If you listen to Gesualdo, it almost sounds like 20th century avant-garde music, but he wrote it in the 1590s.
And if we connect this to the overarching premise of our deep dive, Gesualdo's music is structurally tied to his untouchable status in the aristocratic system. Consider the alternative. If a lesser servant or even a normal court composer had committed a double homicide, they would have been executed immediately.
No question.
Their music would have remained unwritten. Gesualdo's horrific, utterly unique sound exists entirely because the aristocratic system shielded him from the consequences of his actions. The political structure is the very thing that permitted the musical dissonance to exist.
That is wild to think about. The system literally enabled the dissonance. But even the aristocratic bubble eventually meets a force it cannot control or execute the paying public. And to see that collision, we have to look at Claudio Monteverdi and the birth of commercial opera.
Monteverdi is the bridge between two worlds. In 1607, he writes Orfeo. It is widely considered the first truly great opera, pushing past the timid, theoretical experiments of earlier Florentine composers. But we must note who he wrote it for. Orfeo was commissioned for an elite, captive aristocratic court in Mantua.
Right, he's writing for a room full of nobles who are basically there to impress each other and flatter the Duke. But then we hit the structural turning point, the year 1637. The very first commercial opera house opens its doors to the general public in Venice. Anyone with the price of a ticket can walk in.
A huge shift.
And Monteverdi, toward the end of his life, writes his final operas, like The Coronation of Poppea, for these commercial picket-buying stagings. So I have to ask, how does the music physically change when you suddenly have to keep a paying audience in their seats compared to entertaining a captive royal court?
Well, the music adapts to the demands of the market. When audiences are parting with their own money for tickets, they demand to be entertained. They want spectacle. They will walk out if they are bored. So Monteverdi and his contemporaries inject more dances, more elaborate choruses, heightened dramatic arcs, and stronger emotional contrasts.
The pacing has to change.
Exactly. You can no longer rely heavily on polite, dry recitative.
Let's pause there for those of us who aren't opera buffs. What exactly is recitative and why is it dry?
Recitative is a style of vocal delivery where a singer adopts the rhythms of ordinary speech. It is not a sweeping, beautiful melody. It is essentially sung dialogue, accompanied by a very sparse instrumentation, usually just a harpsichord or a cello.
So it's just to move the story along.
Yes, its primary function is to get through the plot quickly so you can get to the next big emotional aria. In a court setting where decorum is prized, audiences might tolerate long stretches of this dry exposition. But the commercial system demands that the music actively grab and hold the audience's attention. If the plot drags, the ticket buyers riot.
It's the birth of show business. And once you have show business, you have monopolies, market savvy, and ruthless competition. Stove talks about the political sabotage in France with a composer named Jean-Baptiste Lully.
Lully is a fascinating character study in leveraging a system. He was an Italian expatriate. He actually started out as a kitchen hand and a dancer who managed to become more French than the French. He secured immense, unprecedented favor with King Louis XIV, and he used that political capital ruthlessly to crush his rivals.
Stove tells this story about a Venetian composer named Cavalli. Cavalli is brought to Paris to write a massive, prestigious opera for the Sun King's marriage, and Lully just actively sabotages it.
Yes, Lully inserted his own ballet sequences into the middle of Cavalli's opera.
How does inserting a ballet ruin an opera? Doesn't it just make the show longer?
It shatters the pacing and steals the spotlight. Imagine watching a tense, emotional, dramatic film, and every 20 minutes it pauses for a 10-minute, highly choreographed, brightly lit dance sequence that has nothing to do with the plot.
Okay, yeah, that would be incredibly annoying.
It exhausts the audience. It breaks the dramatic tension Cavalli was trying to build. Furthermore, the French court loved ballet, and Louis XIV himself often danced in them. By inserting these ballets, Lully ensured the audience was cheering for his contributions while finding Cavalli's actual opera tedious by comparison.
He totally hijacked it.
Lully understood that in a centralized, absolute monarchy, the system is the king. Control the king's favor, and you hold a monopoly on what music is allowed to succeed.
Lully was a political shark. But if Lully mastered the absolute monarchy, George Friedrich Handel was the ultimate musical CEO navigating a chaotic free market. Handel moves to London in 1712 and just completely dominates the commercial scene. He's making fortunes, losing them, and dealing with absolute divas.
His management style was notoriously violently hands-on.
That is putting it mildly. Stove tells this story where Handel is arguing with his star soprano, Francesca Cuzzoni. She refuses to sing an aria the way he wrote it. So Handel physically grabs her by the waist and threatens to throw her out the window.
It's unbelievable.
He screams at her, "You are a veritable she-devil, but I would have you know that I am Beelzebub, the chief of devils."
And he was equally combative with his male colleagues. Early in his career, he fought an actual sword duel with his fellow composer Johann Mattheson during a performance at an opera house in Hamburg.
Over who got to conduct.
Yes, and Handel was only saved from being run through because Matheson's sword broke against a large metal button on Handel's coat.
A metal button literally saved the Messiah. But beyond the backstage drama, Handel's brilliance was in how he pivoted when the market shifted against him. In 1728, John Gay and Christophe Papouche staged something called The Beggar's Opera.
Which was a massive runaway hit.
Huge. And it actively mocked Handel's elite Italian-style operas. They used plain English, relatable low-class characters, and they even plagiarized some of Handel's music to satirize him.
It was a massive market disruption. And how does Handel react to this? He doesn't just retreat and sulk. He doesn't demand the king ban the Beggar's Opera. He recognizes that the public's taste is fundamentally shifting away from expensive, imported Italian opera. So he systematically abandons it.
He pivots his entire business model.
He pivots to writing English-language oratorios.
And an oratorio is basically an opera without the expensive sets and costumes, right?
Structurally, yes. It is a large-scale musical work for orchestra and voices, typically with a religious theme, performed in a concert hall without acting, scenery, or costumes. Works like Messiah, Judas Maccabeus, Saul.
So he just cut his costs.
Exactly. By stripping away the expensive Italian singers and the lavish stage sets, he lowered his overhead. By using the English language, he appealed directly to the emerging British middle class. He even ruthlessly recycled some of his old, failed operatic material into these new works. He found a new product for a new market demand.
It's pure entrepreneurial adaptation. But sometimes the system doesn't offer a free market for you to pivot within. Sometimes it imposes a very specific, rigid, inescapable constraint, and the composer has to innovate within that exact box. Which brings us to Antonio Vivaldi.
Vivaldi, the Red Priest. Today, he is universally known for the Four Seasons, and he composed an astonishing number of works, including around 500 concertos.
There's that old, slightly mean joke that Vivaldi didn't write 500 concertos, he just wrote the same concerto 500 times.
A critique that Stowe firmly rejects, pointing out the immense variety within those works. But we have to look at why he wrote so many. The sheer volume of his output wasn't just a burst of unprompted inspiration. It was dictated by his institutional system. Vivaldi was the music master at a Venetian orphanage called the Pietà.
If you're listening to this and thinking, wait, an orphanage had a need for 500 concertos. I had the exact same thought. How did that even work?
Well, the Pietà was not a grim Dickensian workhouse. It was an institution for the illegitimate daughters of Venetian noblemen. It was well-funded, and it boasted a dedicated, all-female orchestra and choir made up of the residents. Music was their primary education and their primary source of fundraising.
So this institution required a constant, unrelenting stream of new material for these specific young women to play at their Sunday services and public concerts to keep the wealthy donors happy.
Precisely. Vivaldi's creativity was structurally engineered by the needs of the Pietà's female orchestra. The specific instrumentation he chose, often featuring multiple violins or unique woodwinds, the varying levels of technical difficulty, accommodating both virtuosos and beginners within the ensemble, and the rapid rate of production, all of it was a direct response to the constraints of his employment.
So we've seen the church system, the aristocratic system, and the early commercial market. But as we move into the classical and romantic eras, the tension between a composer's individual agency, their genius, and the systems that funded them reaches a boiling point. The rules of survival change, and we really see three distinct models of how artists survived this tension.
Let's examine Model 1, the isolated servant. And the prime example here is Joseph Haydn.
Everyone thinks of Papa Haydn as this neat, liveried, almost boring figure, the genial grandfather of the symphony. But the reality of his day-to-day life is stunning. He spent 3 decades cut off from the world, working as a literal servant at the remote summer palace of the Hungarian Princess Esterházy.
We must emphasize the isolation here. The Esterházy Palace was built in a swamp, far from the cultural hub of Vienna. Haydn was required to wear a uniform. He was required to produce music on demand for the prince's daily entertainment symphonies, operas, chamber music, music for the prince's weird stringed instrument, the baritone.
He's essentially a highly specialized, very well-dressed butler.
But this intense institutional confinement bred one of the most prolific and innovative outputs in musical history. We are talking about 104 canonical symphonies and a mastery of the string quartet that redefined chamber music.
It's staggering.
Haydn himself perfectly summarized how this system affected him. He wrote, "I was cut off from the world, there was no one to confuse or torment me, and I was forced to become original."
Forced to become original. The stability of the Esterházy system, the fact that he didn't have to hustle for ticket sales in London or appease fickle public tastes in Paris, allowed him to run deep, sustained experiments with musical form. He had his own private orchestra to test out ideas every single day. It's fascinating to compare that isolated laboratory with what happens later in his life.
Yes, because after his prince dies, Haydn travels to London and enters the commercial market.
And he crushes it. He writes the London symphonies, he makes a fortune, he's treated like a celebrity. But he could only do that because he spent 30 years building his genius inside the protective walls of the aristocratic system.
Haydn accepted the fireplace the system built for him. But Model 2 represents the friction of agency. This is the composer who could not or would not adapt to the rigid demands of the system, and that is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart.
Okay, we have to dismantle the Hollywood myth here. The movie Amadeus is an absolute cinematic masterpiece, but as Stove points out, it gets almost everything wrong about the structural reality of Mozart's life.
The film portrays Mozart as a giggling idiot, a man-child who was merely a passive vessel for God's voice, while his rival Salieri schemes against him. The historical reality is that Mozart was a highly conscious, deeply ambitious, and incredibly hardworking creator.
Right.
And his struggles were largely self-inflicted because of his absolute inability to navigate the political realities of the patronage system.
Hold on, I want to push back on that a bit. Self-inflicted feels really harsh. I mean, he wrote The Marriage of Figaro, he wrote Don Giovanni, he was a generational talent. Shouldn't the system have made room for him rather than forcing him to be a diplomat?
Well, from a modern perspective, yes, we believe genius should excuse bad behavior. But the 18th century patronage system did not care about our modern conception of the artist. The system required deference. It required obedience to an archbishop or an emperor.
And Mozart just couldn't do that.
He was headstrong. He was openly contemptuous of other people's opinions, including his employers. He fundamentally lacked the diplomatic tact that Haydn possessed. Talent did not negate his status as a servant in the eyes of the system. Because he refused to play the political game, he got fired from steady jobs, he alienated patrons, and he lived in poverty at times, despite his overwhelming, undeniable genius.
And this friction between his agency and the unforgiving system culminates tragically, but also triumphantly, in his final years.
Yes. In 1788, Mozart writes his 3 final symphonies, numbers 39, 40, and 41, the Jupiter Symphony. They are arguably his greatest orchestral achievements, but consider the context he wrote them without a commission.
Nobody paid him to do it.
He wrote them without a guaranteed audience. In fact, Stove notes it's highly likely he never even heard these masterpieces performed by a full orchestra before he died in 1791.
When I read that, the best analogy I could think of was a brilliant, temperamental, modern software engineer. It's like a brilliant coder who gets fired from Google or Apple because he won't wear shoes to the office. He insults the vice president in an email, and he refuses to work on the projects he's assigned.
A very modern type of friction.
Right. He goes home to his basement, and he writes an operating system that is light years ahead of Windows or Mac OS. It's pure genius. But because he has no marketing team, no server space, and no venture capital, it just sits on a hard drive until he dies. The code is genius, but the system is what actually ships the product. Mozart didn't have the system to ship his final symphonies.
That is a very apt parallel. Mozart's individual genius produced the work, but because he was structurally alienated from the system that funded performance, the work remains silent during his lifetime. But that alienation sets the stage for Model 3, the artist's hero, the composer who hacks the system entirely. Enter Ludwig van Beethoven.
Beethoven is where the entire structural paradigm shifts. He arrives in Vienna, and he realizes he doesn't have to be an isolated servant like Haydn, but he also learns from Mozart's mistakes. He realizes he needs funding.
Beethoven managed to secure massive aristocratic subsidies from several wealthy noblemen in Vienna. They literally pooled their money to pay him an annual salary just to stay in Vienna and compose.
Which is incredible.
But crucially, he utterly refused the role of a servant. He demanded to be treated as an equal to the aristocracy.
The famous Napoleon anecdote perfectly captures this structural shift. Beethoven originally dedicated his massive Third Symphony, the Eroica, to Napoleon Bonaparte, seeing him as a champion of liberty and the French Revolution. But when Napoleon crowns himself emperor, Beethoven is furious.
Oh, he was livid.
He physically scratches Napoleon's name off the title page of the manuscript. He scratches it so violently with his pen that he tears a physical hole in the paper.
It's impossible to imagine Bach or Haydn openly defying a head of state like that. Beethoven shifts the paradigm from the composer as a skilled craftsman to the composer as a defiant, autonomous hero. And we see this even in how he handles his impending deafness.
Which must have been the ultimate crisis for a musician.
Initially, he hides it, terrified it will ruin his career and his social standing. But eventually, he leans into it. He writes on the manuscript of his Razumovsky quartets, "Let your deafness be no longer a secret, not even in art."
He weaponizes his own tragedy. He makes it part of his brand. He is the suffering genius wrestling with fate. And if Beethoven built the mold of the autonomous artist hero, Franz Liszt took that mold a few decades later and created the rock star.
Liszt embodied the newly emerging touring virtuoso system. He was a phenomenally gifted pianist who toured from Dublin all the way to Constantinople, giving over 1,000 public concerts in a single decade.
A grueling schedule.
He famously declared, consciously echoing the absolute monarch Louis XIV, "Le concert, c'est moi. I am the concert."
He didn't need an orchestra. He didn't need a singer. Just him and a piano. And the stories about Liszt's power over the system are insane. Stove recounts an incident where Liszt is performing for the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, one of the most terrifying autocratic men on the planet. The Tsar starts talking to someone during the performance, and Liszt just stops playing.
He just takes his hands off the keys.
The Tsar looks over and says, "Pray continue, Monsieur Liszt." And Liszt replies, "When your majesty speaks, all others should be silent." Yes, shut down the Tsar.
And he survived that encounter. He had that level of systemic immunity because of his unprecedented hold on the public. He generated actual fan mania, a phenomenon they literally called listomania. Women would shriek, faint, and fling themselves at him. Stove mentions one besotted admirer who found a cigar butt that Liszt had smoked, and she kept it hidden in her undergarments for 25 years.
That is deeply unsanitary, but it perfectly proves the point. The system had shifted entirely from pleasing a localized prince in a swamp to commanding the worship of a mass pan-European ticket-buying audience. The performer became bigger than the patron.
But as the 19th century rolls on, and especially as we enter the brutal conflicts of the 20th century, the systems shaping music become increasingly ideological and bureaucratic. The state realizes that music is not just entertainment. It is a highly potent vehicle for national identity and political power.
The heavy hand of the state. We see early glimpses of this with Giuseppe Verdi in Italy. Verdi wasn't just writing operas, he was navigating a maze of state censorship.
Take his opera Un ballo in Maschera, a masked ball. The original plot was based on a true historical event, the assassination of King Gustavus III of Sweden at a masked ball.
Right.
But Italy at the time was a patchwork of states, many under strict Austrian control, and the censors were absolutely terrified of anything depicting regicide on stage.
Right. They thought if the peasants saw a king get murdered in an opera, it would give them ideas to do it in real life.
So the censorship system forced Verdi to completely relocate the plot. He couldn't set it in Europe, and he couldn't have a king. He had to change the victim from a European monarch to an English colonial governor and move the setting to colonial Massachusetts.
It's absurd. You have this deeply Italian opera about assassination happening in Boston. But the public found a way to subvert the system anyway. They used Verdi's own name as a political weapon.
They adopted the slogan, "Viva Verdi."
Which didn't just mean like, long live the composer.
Correct. It functioned as a political acronym. It stood for Viva Vittorio Emanuele Re d'Italia, long live Victor Emmanuel, King of Italy. So even while the state censors tried desperately to control the narrative on stage, the public bypassed them and turned the composer himself into a mascot for Italian unification.
But if 19th century censorship was annoying, 20th century totalitarian systems were legal. We have to talk about Soviet Russia and the Zhivkov Purge of 1948.
This is a stark, terrifying example of a system entirely subjugating art to political ideology. Andrei Zdonov, Joseph Stalin's cultural commissar, unleashed a brutal bureaucratic purge against the Soviet Union's greatest living composers, primarily targeting Dmitri Shostakovich and Sergei Prokofiev.
They were accused of the crime of formalism, which, as Stove notes, was a term that was never actually defined in any legal or musical sense.
So what did it practically mean in that context?
It was essentially a catch-all word for anything the state apparatus deemed insufficiently populist, overly pessimistic, or tainted by Western avant-garde influences. If your symphony didn't sound like a glorious, triumphant march for the tractor-driving proletariat, you were guilty of formalism.
It was a purely bureaucratic weapon. To survive, and we must stress that in Stalin's Russia, survival literally meant not being sent to a Siberian gulag or shot in the back of the head. These men, who were undeniable musical titans, were forced into grotesque public self-abasement.
It's so hard to read about.
They had to stand up in front of committees, apologize for their art, thank the Communist Party for correcting their errors, and promise to simplify their music to meet the ideological demands of the state. The system violently engineered the musical output through terror.
Now, at this point in his book, Stove pivots to critique Western democracies in the post-1945 era, and as we established at the top of the show, we are going to present his argument impartially, avoiding taking sides, just to look at the structural mechanics of what he's claiming.
Yes. Stove argues that after World War II, a new kind of bureaucratic system took hold in the West, driven by taxpayer funding. He points to entities like the National Endowment for the Arts in America or the massive state-funded broadcasting networks in Europe.
He's pretty harsh about them.
He describes them as being run by Orwellian bureaucrats who were answerable to no one and who arbitrarily decided what new music gained official sanction and funding.
He points out a major structural shift here. For the first time outside of dictatorships, music wasn't being funded because a prince wanted it for his court, or the church needed it for mass, or because paying customers actually wanted to buy a ticket to hear it. It was being pushed by an academic committee.
Now, leaving aside Stove's evident vocal distaste for the atonal or experimental music this system often produced, let's examine the structural implication neutrally. If an artist's funding is completely guaranteed by a state bureaucracy, regardless of whether a single member of the public enjoys or buys tickets to the performance, how does that alter what is created?
It totally rewires the incentives.
Yeah.
It removes the commercial market constraint. When Monteverdi or Handel wrote, they were tethered to audience intelligibility. If the audience hated it, they didn't get paid. But state funding replaces that market constraint with the aesthetic preferences of a grant committee.
Exactly.
You aren't writing for the public anymore. You are writing to satisfy the academic, theoretical, or ideological criteria of the specific bureaucrats holding the purse strings.
Precisely. It is simply another system shaping the sound. Whether it's the medieval church protecting manuscripts, an absolute monarch demanding ballets, a commercial opera house demanding spectacle, or a modern arts council demanding avant-garde experimentation, the funding mechanism inevitably dictates the parameters of creation.
Which brings us to the ultimate system, the system that takes everything we've talked about, the church, the market, the state, and uses it to build what we call the canon. It's how we as a society decide who is immortal and who is forgotten. Stove has this great blunt quote. He says, "Musical posterity is a bitch goddess."
It's a provocative way to phrase it, but the historical evidence forcefully backs him up. He points out a shocking truth to modern listeners 150 years ago. If you asked the European musical establishment who the supreme immortals were, they wouldn't just say Beethoven or Mozart. They would list composers like Giacomo Meyerbeer, Fermanagh Halevi, Johann Nepomuk Hummel, and Louis Spohr.
Meyerbeer, Halevi, Hummel, Spohr. I consider myself a relatively educated person, but I could not hum a single bar by any of those guys. And yet, Stove notes that at the time, many critics and audiences thought Hummel and Spohr actually surpassed Beethoven in skill. How on earth does an immortal genius, someone who is universally famous in their own lifetime, just get completely forgotten?
They get forgotten because they fall out of the feedback loop. Let's walk through the invisible mechanics of how a canon is built over centuries. It's a multi-stage, self-reinforcing process.
Okay, lay out the loop for us.
Step 1, selection. A system, whether it's the church, the state, or the market, selects a work. It funds its initial creation.
Right.
Step 2, preservation and performance. The institution decides to preserve that work and fund the continued performance of it. An orchestra buys the sheet music, the conductor programs it into the season.
Okay, that makes sense.
Step 3, repetition. This continuous repetition over decades creates an aura of prestige. The work becomes familiar to the audience, and familiarity breeds a sense of inherent authority. People assume it is played often because it is the best.
It's just a classic, so it must be good.
Step 4, education. That prestige then shapes educational curricula. Conservatories teach their students how to play it, universities assign essays on it.
And then,
And finally, step 5, reinforcement. The new generation is explicitly taught that this specific set of works is the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. When they grow up to run the orchestras and the grant committees, they program the exact same works, flawlessly reinforcing the canon for the next generation.
wow. So it's a massive self-fulfilling prophecy. Meyerbeer and Hummel were massive in their day, but for whatever reason, shifting tastes, a lack of institutional champions pushing their work after their deaths, or just bad luck, they dropped out of the repetition cycle. And once you drop out of the repetition cycle, you lose the prestige, you get dropped from the university curriculum, and you vanish into the unwritten void.
Exactly. And we must briefly zoom out from music here because this feedback loop is universal. This exact same structural system applies to almost everything we consume culturally. Think about literature. Which books get meticulously archived by universities and placed on high school syllabi?
Right. The books on the syllabus become the classics because they are on the syllabus. If a brilliant novel from 1850 isn't selected by an English department to be taught to freshmen, it effectively ceases to exist in the cultural memory and museums. Who decides which paintings get hung in the main well-lit halls with the audio guides and which ones get shoved into the basement storage vaults? The curator's institutional choice essentially dictates what the public perceives as a masterpiece.
And in our modern era, think about digital platforms. How do algorithms and curated playlists dictate what modern music achieves importance?
Oh, absolutely. If a Spotify editor puts a new song on the Today's Talk Hits playlist, tens of millions of people hear it instantly. It achieves a natural importance simply through massive systemic exposure. It's the exact same feedback loop we saw with the medieval church or the Parisian opera house, just running on silicon and code instead of parchment and sheet music. Preservation and exposure masquerade as natural importance.
This raises an important, overarching question for us to confront directly as we look back over Stowe's historical lens.
Yeah, I have to ask it explicitly. What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis is that the music that survived the gauntlet appears to us as timeless, self-selecting, and purely merit-based. We perceive a Beethoven symphony as floating above history, a perfect object that just exists. But the massive grinding systems that actually enabled its creation, funded its survival, forced its repetition, and engineered its prestige remain completely hidden from our view.
We walk into the garden and we see the beautiful flower, but we are completely blind to the hydroponic greenhouse, the chemical fertilizers, the political zoning laws that allow the garden to be built, and the botanists manipulating the temperature to keep that specific flower alive while letting others wither.
Precisely. Now, to be incredibly clear, acknowledging the systems does not mean that Beethoven or Mozart weren't geniuses. Their music is objectively astonishing.
Right. We aren't saying they were untalented hacks who just had a good marketing team and a lucky algorithm.
Exactly. What it means is that individual agency, which we call genius, and structure, which we call systems, are locked in a complex, inescapable dance. Genius provides the indispensable spark, but the system builds the fireplace, buys the wood, tends the flame, and invites the audience into the room to see it. Without the spark, there is no light. But without the fireplace, the spark just burns out on the cold floor.
That is a perfect way to look at it. The spark and the fireplace. And that brings us to a final reflection. Not a summary of what we've covered today, but something to mull over on your own as you go about your week. The next time you listen to a piece of music, whether it's Mozart in a concert hall or a new track on a streaming service, the next time you read a classic novel or look at a famous painting in a museum and call it timeless, ask yourself a question. How much are you actually hearing in the notes themselves? And how much are you hearing the echoes of inherited systems of attention that told you to listen in the first place?
It changes how you hear everything.
It really does. Crisis in perception is not about telling people what to think. It's about making the systems shaping perception more visible. Because when structural forces remain hidden, meaningful change becomes far more difficult to imagine. Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same: to think critically, follow the evidence, and remain open to changing your mind when the facts lead somewhere unexpected. Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and learn to spot the crisis in perception. Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description. Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, share, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.